My name is Kira Lane. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I have been the woman people describe as steady, not exciting, not dramatic, not complicated, just steady. I live in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon. I work in medical records administration, an invisible profession that suits an invisible woman. I am the one who remembers birthdays, who brings the right dish to family dinners, who texts to make sure everyone got home safely. If there is tension in a room, I smooth it. If there is silence, I fill it gently. If there is conflict, I step back. People think that means I am harmless. They mistake my calm for compliance, my softness for surrender, my silences for weakness. What they don't understand is that silence can be a strategy, and patience can be power. This story is not about revenge. It's not about screaming confrontations or dramatic exposure. There are no shattered glasses or public humiliations. What happened to me unfolded quietly, inside bedrooms with closed doors, across dinner tables where no one noticed the shift in my breathing, through glances that looked normal to everyone else. My brother-in-law discovered a secret from when I was 18, a medical file I never thought would see daylight again. A mistake, a diagnosis, a moment in my past that carried shame I worked years to bury. He found it, and he used it. Whenever my sister traveled for work, he reminded me that he still had it, that he could send it, that he could misunderstand it publicly. And little by little, my life became something I endured rather than lived. For a long time, I believed survival meant compliance. I believed silence kept everyone safe. My sister, my parents, the fragile piece of our family. I told myself I was protecting something bigger than myself. But there comes a moment when protecting others becomes betraying yourself. This story is about that moment. It's about the quiet shift from fear to clarity, from shame to ownership, from being cornered to stepping out of the corner without anyone realizing the walls had moved. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't paint him as a monster or myself as a martyr. This is simply the truth of how psychological control works and how it can unravel without a single raised voice. If you've ever stayed silent to keep the peace, have you ever wondered what it was costing you? If you asked my family who I was, they would have given you almost identical answers. Kira, she's the calm one. She doesn't like conflict. She's sensitive. She worries too much. My older sister, Amelia, used to introduce me at gatherings as my sweet little sister who keeps us all organized. She meant it as a compliment, and I accepted it as one. At family dinners, I refilled glasses before anyone asked. I cleared plates without being told. When conversations drifted into politics or money, topics that sharpened voices, I quietly excused myself to the kitchen. I learned early that my absence reduced friction. My brother-in-law, Daniel, noticed that too. The first time I met him, he studied me the way some men study a resume, looking for weaknesses, gaps, leverage. He shook my hand just a little too long and said, "You're the quiet one, huh? That's rare these days." It wasn't an insult. It wasn't praise either. It was a classification. To them, I was predictable. I was the one who would never cause a scene, the one who would choose harmony over confrontation every single time. And they weren't wrong. I had spent years building that reputation carefully. At 18, after the medical incident that nearly fractured my life, I rebuilt myself around stability. No chaos, no impulsive choices, no attention. I moved through my 20s like someone walking across thin ice, slowly, carefully, never stomping. My career in medical records felt safe. I handled other people's histories with clinical distance, confidential files, sealed envelopes, secure systems. I believed information should be protected, that privacy was sacred. Maybe that's why the irony stung so deeply later. But back then, in those early years of my sister's marriage, I was simply background. Amelia was vibrant. She worked in marketing, traveled often, and filled rooms with her laughter. Daniel complemented her energy with polished charm. He worked in finance, always well-dressed, always articulate. Together, they looked composed and ambitious, and I fit neatly into their picture. When they hosted, I arrived early to help set up. When Amelia traveled for work, I sometimes stopped by to water her plants or bring in packages. It felt normal, safe, family. Daniel would thank me with easy smiles. "You're a lifesaver, Kira. "You're so reliable. Amelia's lucky to have you." The praise felt harmless, even kind. Looking back, I realized something uncomfortable. I was proud of being underestimated. It meant I didn't have to perform. It meant no one scrutinized me too closely. No one asked hard questions about my past. No one dug into that file from when I was 18. The file I believed was sealed in both hospital archives and family memory. To them, I was the dependable younger sister who still hadn't fully figured herself out. The one who didn't date much. The one who chose practicality over risk. The one who just needed more confidence. They thought I lacked power. They didn't understand that restraint is not the same as weakness. But I didn't understand it yet either. At that stage of my life, my silence wasn't a strategy. It was a habit. A survival reflex shaped by shame. I didn't question the subtle way Daniel's eyes lingered sometimes. I didn't question the way he'd stand a little too close when Amelia stepped out of the room. I told myself it was harmless. Because I was the calm one, the steady one, the one who didn't overreact. I had spent so long convincing everyone I wasn't a threat that I never imagined someone would see that as an opportunity. And that was who I was to them. Useful, predictable, invisible. And invisibility can be a dangerous thing, especially when someone decides to test how far it reaches. The first time Daniel crossed a line, it didn't look like a line. It looked like a joke. Amelia was in Chicago for a 3-day conference. I had stopped by their house to bring in a package and check on the dog. Daniel was working from home that afternoon. He greeted me casually, laptop open on the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, in that effortless way that makes competence look attractive. "You're saving us again," he said. "I don't know what we'd do without you." I smiled. "You'd manage." That should have been the end of it. Instead, he added lightly, "You always manage, don't you? Even when things get complicated." There was a pause, small, almost invisible. I felt something shift in the air. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked down at his laptop, clicked something, and shrugged. "Nothing. Just saying you're resilient. Not everyone bounces back the way you did at 18. The word landed like glass under bare skin. 18. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. My throat tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Years of practice. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied evenly. He smiled, soft, knowing. "Of course you don't." Then he changed the subject. To anyone overhearing, nothing happened. No raised voices, no accusation, no threat, just an awkward comment that could easily be dismissed as poor phrasing. But I knew what he was referencing. When I was 18, I had been hospitalized briefly after a severe mental health episode triggered by medication. It wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine. No police, no spectacle. But it was documented, diagnosed, filed, and in small communities, whispers travel faster than facts. My parents had treated it like a fragile artifact, never discussed, never acknowledged publicly. We moved forward, quietly. I believed it was behind me, so how did he know? That question pulsed behind my eyes the entire drive home. I replayed the moment again and again. His tone hadn't been cruel. It hadn't been sympathetic either. It had been observational, strategic. Testing. That night, Amelia called to tell me about her conference. I almost told her. The words hovered at the edge of my mouth. But what would I say? "Your husband made a vague comment about my past." It sounded paranoid, petty. So I swallowed it. The next time it happened was subtler. A week later, Amelia mentioned during dinner that I seemed tired lately. Before I could respond, Daniel said, "Let's not overwhelm her. We know stress isn't her favorite thing." His eyes flicked to mine for half a second. I felt the cut again. "No one else noticed." Amelia laughed. "Daniel, don't be dramatic." But he wasn't being dramatic. He was calibrating. Each remark was deniable, harmless on the surface. If I reacted, I would look oversensitive. If I accused him, I would sound unstable, which was the quiet brilliance of it. He wasn't threatening me outright. He was reminding me that he could. And in those small reminders, something inside me began to tighten. Not panic. Recognition. The first small cut doesn't bleed loudly. It doesn't demand attention. It sits beneath the skin and waits. I started noticing how often Amelia traveled. How often Daniel and I were alone in the house, even if only briefly. I began timing my visits carefully, avoiding lingering, but I told myself I was imagining patterns, because admitting otherwise meant acknowledging something darker, that he possessed information about me that I did not consent to him having, and that he was enjoying the fact that I knew it. That's how it begins. Not with force, not with obvious danger, but with a smile that lasts 1 second too long, with a memory spoken softly enough that no one else hears it, with a reminder that your past isn't as buried as you believed, and with the quiet understanding that someone is holding something over you just to see how you react. I didn't react, and that was exactly what he was counting on. The third time, it wasn't a comment, it was a touch. Amelia had left for a 4-day client retreat in Seattle. I had promised to stop by one evening to drop off a folder she forgot and let the dog out. I told myself it was routine, that avoiding the house entirely would look suspicious. Daniel opened the door, already smiling. "You're becoming part-time staff," he joked. I stepped inside, keeping my tone light. Invoices in the mail. We moved into the kitchen. I set the folder on the counter. He stood closer than necessary while I explained where Amelia wanted it placed. I shifted subtly, creating space. He closed it. It wasn't aggressive, not overtly, just proximity. When I turned to leave, his hand landed on my lower back, guiding, as if escorting me to the door. The touch lingered half a second too long. A normal person might have brushed it off. Family members hug. They touch shoulders. They stand close in narrow hallways. But this wasn't familial. It wasn't affectionate either. It was possessive. I stepped forward out of reach. I should go. He leaned casually against the wall. "You're always in a hurry when Amelia's not here." There it was again. Layered, suggestive, deniable. "I have work in the morning," I said. "Relax, Kira." His voice softened. "You act like I'm dangerous." My heartbeat ticked upward. Not from fear exactly, but from awareness. "You're not," I replied. He smiled. "Good." The word felt like a checkpoint. That night I lay in bed replaying every detail. His hand, the tone, the phrasing. I questioned my own interpretation the way I always did. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe I was sensitive because of my history. Maybe I was still that 18-year-old girl who overreacted to medication and ended up in a hospital bed under fluorescent lights. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day inside a nightmare. You walk into it slowly, step by step, convincing yourself each moment is manageable. After that evening, Daniel's comments sharpened slightly. "If you ever need someone to talk to about stress, I'm discreet. You know I understand more about your past than Amelia does." That file must have been hard to live down. The first time he said the word file, my blood went cold. He was confirming it, not a rumor, not hearsay. Documentation. And he wanted me to know that he had it. I considered confronting him directly, demanding to know how he accessed medical records, threatening legal action. After all, I worked in medical administration. I understood privacy law intimately, but something held me back. Proof. He never explicitly stated he possessed it. He never said, "I have your records." He danced around it carefully, intelligently. And if I accused him without evidence, what would it look like? The quiet sister spiraling. The sensitive one is misinterpreting harmless comments. He was constructing a narrative where I would lose credibility the moment I spoke. So I did what I had always done. I minimized. I shortened my visits. I texted instead of stopping by. I avoided being alone in rooms with him when possible, but I never refused outright, because refusal would signal fear, and fear would confirm power. Then one evening, as Amelia packed for another trip, Daniel looked at me across the dinner table and said, "We'll survive without you for a few days, right? Or do you need to check in on me to keep things stable?" Amelia laughed. I did too, but inside something fractured. He wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. He was rehearsing control, and I was helping him do it by pretending nothing was happening. Disrespect becomes normalized when it's small enough to explain away, when it doesn't bruise visibly, when it hides behind smiles and family dinners. And the most dangerous part? You begin to doubt your own discomfort. You tell yourself, if it were truly wrong, it would feel louder. But psychological control rarely announces itself. It whispers, and at that stage, I was still whispering back, through silence. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that I wasn't just being tested. I was being assigned. Families, especially functional-looking ones, operate on unspoken roles. The achiever, the caretaker, the peacemaker, the complicated one, the disappointment, the golden child. I had always been the stabilizer, the quiet corrective force. When Amelia forgot something, I remembered. When our parents worried, I reassured them. When tension rose, I absorbed it. It was a position I stepped into naturally after my episode at 18. Redemption through reliability. Daniel saw that role clearly, and he adjusted himself around it. If I were the stabilizer, then I would protect the structure at any cost. If I were the peacemaker, then I would swallow discomfort to avoid conflict. If I were the one with a history, then I would guard my credibility carefully. He didn't need to threaten me loudly. He just needed to remind me what I stood to lose. The first time he was explicit, without being explicit, was on a Sunday afternoon. Amelia had left early for a brunch meeting. I arrived later to drop off a casserole dish she'd forgotten at my apartment. He let me in without speaking much. The house felt different when she wasn't there. Quieter. Less oxygen somehow. As I turned to leave, he said casually, "You know, if people misunderstood what happened when you were 18, it could change how they see you now." I stopped. He continued, voice calm, almost thoughtful. "Medical language can sound dramatic. Out of context, it's persuasive." There it was. The structure of the cage. He wasn't saying he would expose me. He was reminding me that he could shape the narrative. And in that moment, I understood the role he expected me to play. Silent. Available. Grateful. Obedient to the unspoken agreement. He keeps my past contained. I keep his behavior unquestioned. That realization didn't ignite rage. It ignited clarity. Because once you see the role assigned to you, you can no longer pretend you're improvising. After that day, the physical proximity escalated in increments, so small, they were almost mathematical. A hand resting at my waist during a friendly hug, standing behind me in the kitchen, close enough that I could feel his breath. A murmur near my ear when no one else was in the room. "Don't worry, I protect what's mine." Mine, the word echoed longer than it should have. I never reciprocated, never initiated, never verbally agreed to anything. But I also didn't explode, didn't accuse, didn't expose. From the outside, I remained the same Kira, dependable, present, soft-spoken. Inside, I was cataloging everything. The timing of Amelia's travel, the phrasing he used, the way he avoided direct statements that could be recorded as threats. I began noticing something else, too. He thrived on my restraint. The calmer I appeared, the more confident he became. He mistook composure for submission. He believed the absence of confrontation meant the presence of control. He thought I would never disrupt the family equilibrium, because I never had. And that's the danger of consistency. When you are always the reliable one, no one imagines you capable of strategic change. But the role he assigned me, silent accomplice to my own coercion, was not sustainable. Something in me was beginning to resist, not outwardly, but internally. The stabilizer was tired of stabilizing at her own expense. The peacemaker was starting to question the cost of peace. And the quiet sister was slowly realizing that invisibility is not protection. It is camouflage. And camouflage works both ways. The shift didn't happen during one of his comments. It didn't happen during a touch. It didn't even happen when he finally made the arrangement unmistakably clear. It happened on a Tuesday morning in my office under fluorescent lights that hummed softly above rows of locked filing cabinets. I was reviewing intake forms, routine verification, double-checking consent signatures, when a familiar last name appeared on my screen. Mine, not my file, but a request. Access attempt logged, user credentials flagged. Timestamp, 2:14 a.m. The system had automatically blocked it because the credentials didn't have sufficient clearance, but I recognized the username. Daniels. He had tried to access archived medical data through a network partner portal tied to his investment firm's health subsidiary. He wasn't inside my hospital's system directly, but he was fishing through affiliated databases. At 2:14 a.m., my hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I stared at the log calmly, almost clinically, as if it belonged to someone else. A patient file, a case study. He wasn't bluffing. He had been looking. The story he wanted to hold over me wasn't just a rumor. He had documentation, or at least he was trying to secure it. In that moment, something subtle rearranged inside me. For months, I had been reacting emotionally, minimizing, rationalizing, doubting my own perception. But data is neutral. Data doesn't gaslight you. The access attempt was real, time-stamped, traceable. And suddenly the narrative shifted. He wasn't a man holding quiet power. He was a man creating a digital trail. The realization didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel steady. For the first time since this began, I wasn't cornered in ambiguity. I had something concrete, not explosive, not dramatic, but factual. That evening, Amelia called to say she'd be flying to Denver for another 3-day trip. Her voice was bright, unaware. "Can you check on the house again?" she asked. I paused. The old version of me would have said yes immediately. The stabilizer, the reliable one. Instead, I said, "I can stop by once, briefly." There was silence on the other end, barely noticeable. A recalibration. "Of course," she said. "Whatever works for you." That small boundary felt enormous. Not defiant, just intentional. When I arrived at the house 2 days later, Daniel greeted me with that same composed smile. "You're later than usual," he noted. "I've been busy," I replied evenly. We stood in the kitchen, the air thick but quiet. He stepped closer. I didn't step back. Not because I was yielding, because I wasn't reacting. He seemed to search my face for something. Fear, maybe? Compliance. He didn't find it. "You're different lately," he said. "Am I?" "Yes." A slight narrowing of his eyes. "Quieter." That almost made me smile. He thought my silence had deepened. He didn't realize it had sharpened. "I'm just focused," I said. "On what?" his expression seemed to ask. I let the question hang, because this time, I wasn't the one being studied. I left the house that evening without lingering, without apologizing, without filling the silence. In my car, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and breathed. Not shakily, not dramatically, just steadily. The shift wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. He believed my past was leverage. But he had underestimated something fundamental about me. I work in systems. I understand records. And if he had touched my history without authorization, he had already made a mistake. The kind that doesn't require confrontation. The kind that unfolds quietly. That Tuesday morning, under sterile office lighting, I stopped being prey. Not because I felt powerful, but because I felt informed. And information, when handled correctly, doesn't need to shout. It simply waits. After that Tuesday, I stopped reacting internally the way he expected me to. Before, my silence had been protective, instinctual, a reflex shaped by shame and fear of destabilizing my family. Now it has become deliberate. There's a difference. When silence is fear, it feels tight in your chest. When silence is a strategy, it feels spacious. Daniel noticed the change before anyone else did. Amelia left for Toronto the following week. She kissed him goodbye at the door, waved at me from the driveway, and disappeared into a taxi. The house fell into its familiar quiet. I didn't volunteer to stop by that evening. He texted instead. "Daniel, you coming to check on things?" Not the dog, not the house, just things. I waited 2 hours before replying. Me. "Busy tonight. Everything okay?" A few minutes passed. "Daniel, of course, just making sure we're aligned." Aligned. He was probing for the old pattern. Me stepping in, me accommodating. I didn't take the bait. Me. "I'm sure you've got it handled." That message did something subtle. It shifted responsibility back to him. When I eventually stopped by 2 days later, it was during daylight hours. Intentional. Brief. He opened the door and studied me carefully. "You're distant," he observed. "I've just been prioritizing work," I said. "That's not like you. Family always comes first." There it was, the narrative he relied on. I tilted my head slightly. "Work is family too. It pays my bills." A small smile. Controlled. He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. "You know, people might question your stability if certain information resurfaced." The words were calm, measured. He was escalating. Months ago, that line would have pierced straight through me. I would have felt heat rise, breath shorten. Instead, I simply met his gaze. "You'd have to explain how you accessed it first," I said softly. Silence. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just still. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. It was the first crack I'd seen. He recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I replied evenly. "Just stating facts." Facts. The word landed heavier than an accusation. He stepped back, creating space for the first time. It wasn't a retreat, but it was a recalculation. From that day forward, my silence carried weight. I stopped filling awkward pauses, stopped laughing at ambiguous comments, stopped cushioning conversations. When he stood too close, I didn't flinch. When he hinted, I didn't react. When he watched for fear, I gave him neutrality. People underestimate neutrality. They mistake it for emptiness. But neutrality can be deeply unsettling when someone expects emotional leverage. Amelia, meanwhile, noticed nothing. Or perhaps she noticed that I seemed calmer, more self-contained, and assumed I was finally growing into confidence. In a way I was, but not in the way she imagined. I began documenting everything. Dates, times, phrasing, text messages, access logs at work. Not obsessively, not dramatically, systematically. The way I was trained to handle sensitive information. Daniel believed my silence meant submission. He didn't understand that I had stopped being silent to protect him. Now I was silent because I was building something. Not revenge, not exposure. A safeguard. And the most dangerous thing about that shift? He could feel it. Predators, emotional ones especially, thrive on visible fear. On emotional reactions. On the reassurance that they control the room. When those signals disappear, they grow uncertain. Uncertainty makes people sloppy. He began texting more frequently during Amelia's trips, calling unexpectedly, asking questions about my schedule. Subtle attempts to reassert proximity. Each time I responded minimally, politely, without warmth. Silence had stopped being my weakness. It had become the space where I was thinking 3 steps ahead. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting for the next move in fear. I was waiting in anticipation, because eventually he would push too far. And when he did, I would be ready, not with noise, but with precision. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. After I saw the access attempt in the system logs, I didn't rush to HR. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't confront him publicly. Not because I was afraid, because I understood the process. Unauthorized access, especially across affiliated healthcare systems, isn't handled emotionally. It's handled procedurally, and procedures require patterns. 1 access attempt could be curiosity. 2 could be a coincidence. 3 becomes intent. So I waited, and while I waited, I documented. I requested internal audit reports under the pretense of a routine compliance review. That wasn't unusual in my role. I cross-checked usernames, timestamps, and IP routing patterns. I flagged anomalies, quietly, into a personal compliance log. I kept encrypted on a separate device. Not obsessive, strategic. Within 3 weeks, there were 4 attempts, different times, always late at night. Always routed through the same partner access portal tied to Daniel's firm. He was careful, but not careful enough. Meanwhile, at home, I adjusted my behavior in ways no one noticed. I stopped sharing personal details with Amelia, not out of distance, but discipline. If Daniel had access to my past, I would control my present. No vulnerabilities, no emotional disclosures that could later be reframed. At family dinners, I became even steadier, even kinder. It disarmed suspicion. Daniel, however, began to feel the shift more acutely. One evening, while Amelia packed for another trip, he lingered in the doorway of the guest room, where I stood helping fold clothes. "You've been very composed lately," he said. "I've always been composed. Not like this." He studied me. "You're not scared anymore." I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. I wasn't fearless. I was informed. "I'm not sure why I would be scared," I replied softly. His gaze sharpened. "You know why." And that's when I realized something else. He needed me to be afraid. Without my fear, the leverage felt imaginary. That understanding changed everything. The next time Amelia left town, he escalated, subtly but unmistakably. "You know," he said in the kitchen, voice low, "we don't have to make this adversarial. I've kept things quiet. I can continue to." There it was. The unspoken arrangement is articulated. I placed my glass down carefully. "There is no this, Daniel." He stepped closer. Not touching. Testing. "You're smart, Kira. You understand leverage." I met his eyes calmly. "I understand documentation." The flicker of irritation was quick but visible. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'd risk everything over pride?" Pride. That was his interpretation. He thought I was resisting out of ego. He had no idea I was building a compliance case that didn't require emotional testimony at all. At work, I requested a broader audit expansion under the justification of tightening third-party access controls. It triggered a review process that would eventually involve legal oversight, automatically. Not my accusation. A systemic check, quiet, neutral, inarguable. And while that process moved forward in the background, I began consulting, discreetly, with an external privacy attorney. Not naming him yet, just outlining hypotheticals. "What happens," I asked during the consultation, "if a financial executive attempts unauthorized medical data access through affiliate systems?" The attorney didn't blink. "That's federal violation territory," she said. "Career ending depending on intent." I nodded. Career ending. He believed my secret was devastating. He hadn't considered that his actions, if documented, were measurable in far more concrete consequences. At home, nothing exploded. Amelia continued traveling. Family dinners continued. I continued smiling. Daniel, however, grew sharper in tone, less playful, more probing. He sensed the balance shifting but couldn't identify why. Because what they never noticed was this. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for inevitability. He would either stop or push. And if he pushed, the system would respond. Not because I screamed, not because I accused, but because the data would speak. And data, unlike shame, doesn't get flustered. It doesn't cry. It doesn't hesitate. It simply records. The confirmation didn't come from him. It came from compliance. 6 weeks after the first flagged access attempt, my supervisor called me into her office. The tone was professional, neutral. Kira, we're expanding the audit review. There's a pattern of unauthorized affiliate portal access attempts targeting restricted archives. Legal will be notified. She slid a printed report across the desk. I didn't need to read the name, but I did anyway. Daniel Mercer, full username, IP confirmation, cross-reference timestamps. 5 documented attempts now. One attempt included a data extraction script, blocked automatically but logged. Script. He hadn't just been looking. He had been trying to pull. That was the moment clarity replaced tension entirely. For months, he had made me feel like I was balancing on something fragile. My past, my reputation, my sister's trust. But the reality was this. He was the one creating evidence. I asked carefully, "Will the user be notified?" "Yes," my supervisor said. Standard procedure. Legal contacts the affiliated firm's compliance department first. Then it escalates. Escalates. The word didn't thrill me. It steadied me. That evening, I didn't go to my sister's house. I didn't call Amelia. I didn't text Daniel. I went home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with the silver key pendant resting cool against my collarbone, and I let myself feel, not fear, not triumph, but relief, because the leverage had shifted completely, not emotionally, structurally. The next day, Daniel texted, "Daniel, we need to talk." No emojis, ohs, no casual tone, just that. I waited until evening to respond. Me. About what? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. "Daniel, you know what?" I did. Legal had likely contacted his firm's compliance department that morning. Someone would have flagged the unusual activity. Questions would be asked. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of documentation. When I arrived at the house the following afternoon, daylight again, intentional, he opened the door without smiling. His posture was tighter, less relaxed, the charm dialed down. "You filed something," he said quietly. I walked inside unhurried. "I didn't file anything," I replied truthfully. "The system flagged unusual access." He exhaled sharply. "You knew." "I work in records, Daniel." He stepped closer, not menacing now, but unsettled. "You could have warned me." That almost made me laugh. Not out loud, but internally. Warned him, as if I were obligated to protect him from the consequences he created. "You've been trying to access restricted archives," I said calmly. "Repeatedly. You're overreacting." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm not reacting at all." That was the truth. There was no heat in my chest, no shaking hands. Just clarity. He ran a hand through his hair. "If this escalates, it affects more than just me." I held his gaze. Yes, for the first time there was no pretense between us. No coded language, no hints, just recognition. He had believed my shame was permanent leverage. But shame dissolves under ownership, and he had mistaken silence for weakness. I didn't threaten him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mention federal violations or career implications. I simply said, "I suggest you speak with your firm's legal department." Then I left. In my car, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, procedural, inevitable. He now understood something essential. I wasn't trapped. He was. And the most powerful part? I hadn't exposed him. The system had. There's a moment in every crisis where the path splits. One road leads to exposure, the other leads to containment. After compliance confirmed the escalation process, I had options. I could tell Amelia everything immediately, about the comments, the proximity, the veiled threats. I could show her the audit logs and let the weight of betrayal collapse her marriage overnight. I could go to my parents, frame it as protection, force a confrontation across a dining room table where Daniel's composure would finally crack. I could even preemptively report his behavior to his firm's board, adding context to the access attempts that would ensure termination. All of those paths were available, all irreversible. But I had to ask myself something uncomfortable. Was my goal justice or impact? There's a difference. Impact is loud, immediate, cathartic. Justice is slower, structural, often invisible. That week, Amelia called me from Denver, her voice tired but warm. "Daniel's been weird lately," she said casually. "Distracted. Do you think he's stressed about work?" I could hear the faint thread of concern beneath her tone. This was the moment. I could unravel everything in one conversation. Instead, I asked, "Has he mentioned compliance audits?" A pause. "No, why?" "You might want to ask him." I kept my voice neutral. No accusation, no drama. She exhaled. "Kira, you're being cryptic." "Just ask him," I repeated gently. When we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. If I told her everything now, it would feel like retaliation. Even if justified, it would blur the lines. He would frame it as vindictive, emotional, personal. But if I allowed the compliance investigation to unfold independently, the focus would remain where it belonged, on unauthorized access, on professional misconduct, on documented facts, not my word against his. That was the irreversible choice. I would not weaponize my story. I would let the system address his. 2 days later, he called me unexpectedly. Not a text, a call. I let it ring twice before answering. "What do you want?" he asked, voice tight. "I don't want anything. You set this in motion." I did my job. Silence crackled between us. "You're going to destroy my marriage over this," he said. There it was, the pivot. Shift blame, shift focus. Make me responsible for the consequences he initiated. "I didn't attempt unauthorized data extraction at 2:14 a.m., I replied calmly. He inhaled sharply. He hadn't realized I knew about the script. "You don't understand how firms operate," he muttered. "I understand how records operate." Another silence, then softer, almost pleading. You could still tell them it was a misunderstanding. I closed my eyes briefly. That was the final fork in the road. If I intervened now, if I softened the audit findings, it would tether me to him permanently. He would know I chose to protect him once, and leverage would return, reshaped. "No, I won't interfere," I said evenly. "That's cold." "No," I replied quietly. "It's neutral." Neutrality again. The thing he feared most. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt the weight of the decision settle. Not heavy, just firm. Irreversible doesn't always mean explosive. Sometimes it means refusing to interrupt a process already in motion. I didn't choose revenge. I chose non-intervention. And in doing so, I stepped fully out of the role he assigned me. No longer the stabilizer at my own expense. No longer the keeper of everyone else's comfort. Just a woman who understood that silence, when chosen deliberately, can alter the entire structure of power. From that point forward, whatever happened would not be my doing. It would be his consequence. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally. Externally, life continued exactly as before. Amelia traveled, family dinners happened, group chats buzzed with recipes and holiday plans. But underneath, structures were shifting. Compliance notified Daniel's firm formally. That part I confirmed indirectly through a colleague who handled interorganizational audit correspondence. No details, just acknowledgement that escalation had moved beyond preliminary review, which meant documentation was now archived in 2 separate legal channels. Redundancy, important. I did not contact his firm. I did not add commentary. I did not attach personal context. I let the paperwork speak. Meanwhile, I made small, quiet adjustments in my own life. First, I met again with the privacy attorney. This time, I brought anonymized copies of the audit logs. No names visible, but enough detail for clarity. "If this individual attempts retaliation," I asked. "Retaliation after a compliance escalation would compound liability," she replied, "especially if you've documented prior interactions." "I have," I said simply. "Then you're protected," she answered. Protected. The word felt different from safe. Safe is emotional, protected is structural. Second, I adjusted my presence around Amelia. Not distance, just recalibration. If she asked about Daniel's stress, I didn't speculate. I redirected gently. "Work pressures can be intense," I'd say. No lies. No protection either. Third, I reduced physical proximity entirely. No solo visits to the house. If something needed to be dropped off, I coordinated through Amelia. Public settings only. Daylight only. Daniel noticed immediately. "You don't trust me now?" he asked one evening at a family barbecue, voice low enough that only I could hear. "I'm busy," I replied. "That's not what I asked." I met his gaze calmly. "I prefer clarity." He looked away first. The tension between us wasn't explosive anymore. It was quiet and lopsided, because he now understood something essential. I wasn't containing him anymore, and he couldn't predict what documentation might surface next. 2 weeks later, Amelia called me late at night. Her voice was unsteady. "Did you know Daniel's firm is investigating him?" There it was. "Yes," I said evenly. "I suspected." "You suspected?" Hurt threaded through her tone. "Why didn't you tell me?" I chose my words carefully, because it wasn't my place to announce a professional inquiry. That's between him and his firm. Silence. "Do you know what it's about?" she asked. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. "Is it bad?" "It's serious." I didn't elaborate. She exhaled slowly. "He says it's a misunderstanding." "Then the investigation will clarify that," I replied. Neutral. Always neutral. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room and realized something subtle but profound. I was no longer bracing. For months, my body had carried low-level tension, The anticipation of his next comment, next touch, next implied threat. Now that tension was gone. Not because everything was resolved, but because the power dynamic had shifted into institutional hands. He couldn't corner me privately anymore. Every move he made now risked amplifying scrutiny, and he knew it. The final strategic step I took was personal, not legal. I requested a copy of my own full medical record under patient access rights. Every page, every note from when I was 18. I read it slowly, line by line. Clinical language. Observations, diagnoses, progress notes. Nothing monstrous, nothing shameful. Human vulnerability, documented. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. He had tried to weaponize something I had never fully faced myself, so I faced it. And in doing so, I removed the last invisible hook. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about strengthening foundations while no one is watching. And by the time Daniel realized I was no longer afraid of my past, it was already too late to use it. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens. They arrived with mood changes. Amelia stopped sounding light on the phone. Her sentences are shortened. Her laughter came half a second late, like it had to pass through something heavy before reaching her mouth. Daniel, meanwhile, became quieter in public settings, less polished. The charm that once felt effortless now seemed rehearsed. At Sunday dinner, my father asked him casually, "Everything all right at work?" Daniel smiled. "Just audits, routine stuff." Routine. I kept my eyes on my plate. Across the table, Amelia's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. She knew it wasn't routine. The investigation had escalated beyond internal compliance. That much I could infer from how quickly his demeanor shifted. 3 days later, Amelia called again. "They've put him on administrative leave," she said flatly. "I'm sorry," I replied gently. It wasn't performative. I meant it. Because consequences ripple. They don't isolate themselves to the person who triggered them. They're reviewing data access violations, she continued. Something about unauthorized medical archive attempts. There was a pause, a quiet test. "Do you know anything about that?" she asked. I took a breath. Yes. Silence expanded between us. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because it wasn't about me speaking," I said carefully. "It was about documentation speaking." "You're being careful," she said. Not accusing, observing. "I have to be." Another long silence. Finally, she asked, "Was it your records?" There it was. The direct question. "Yes," I said. Her inhale was sharp. Not dramatic, just stunned. "Why would he—" She trailed off. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer would change her marriage permanently. "I don't know his reasons," I said truthfully. "I only know the attempts were logged." Amelia didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just went very quiet. And in that quiet, something settled. Later that week, Daniel texted me. "Daniel, you've said enough." Interesting phrasing. I hadn't said much at all. I haven't spoken to your firm." A minute passed. "Daniel, Amelia thinks this is personal." I read the message twice, then replied, "It became professional the moment you tried to extract restricted data." No accusation, just sequence. He didn't respond. The shift in power wasn't loud. It was atmospheric. At the next family gathering, he avoided being alone in a room with me. Not because I requested it, because he understood the optics had changed. I was no longer the quiet sister with a fragile past. I was the employee whose records he had tried to access illegally. And that difference mattered. Amelia, however, was unraveling internally. "I feel like I've missed something," she told me during a walk in the park. Like there were cracks I didn't see. I looked at her carefully. "You didn't miss anything," I said softly. "You trusted." Her eyes searched mine. "Did he ever make you uncomfortable?" she asked. This was the edge. I could unload everything now. The comments, the proximity, the implied threats. Or I could let her arrive at conclusions through her own timeline. "He crossed professional boundaries," I said evenly. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the full story either. She nodded slowly, processing. Consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like awareness. Daniel wasn't arrested. He wasn't publicly shamed, but he was suspended, investigated, restricted from system access across affiliate networks pending review. His career trajectory, carefully built, paused indefinitely, and for the first time since this began, he couldn't reposition himself as the calm, composed one, because documentation doesn't respond to charm. It responds to timestamps. At home, in my own apartment, the air felt different, lighter, not because I had won, but because the invisible pressure I had been carrying, the constant awareness of his leverage, was gone. Shame had been replaced by record. Threat had been replaced by procedure. And the most profound consequence? He stopped looking at me like I was cornered. Now, when our eyes met across a room, there was something else there. Calculation, regret, uncertainty. And for someone who once relied on control, uncertainty is the loudest consequence of all. The unraveling didn't happen in one dramatic collapse. It happened in stages. First came defensiveness. Daniel insisted the access attempts were a curiosity, that he'd been exploring a potential investment in healthcare data analytics and clicked into restricted systems unintentionally. Those scripts are auto-generated. That compliance departments overreact. Then came negotiation. Amelia told me he'd offered to resign quietly if the firm would avoid formal reporting. He promised transparency, counseling, a fresh start somewhere smaller. But institutions don't negotiate around unauthorized extraction attempts lightly, especially not when scripts are involved. 2 weeks into his suspension, his firm restricted not only his system access, but also his client portfolio. Temporary, they said. Pending review. Temporary is a dangerous word. It stretches. It strains. It exposes fault lines in marriages that once seemed solid. Amelia stopped wearing her wedding ring at home. Not consciously, I think. Just habitually leaving it on the bathroom counter. When she visited me one evening, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with travel. He says you're overreacting, she told me quietly, that this spiraled because you couldn't let go of the past. There it was. The reframing, the attempt to shift causality back onto me. I didn't flinch. The audit logs exist whether I let go or not, I replied. She watched my face carefully. Did he threaten you? She asked. The question hung in the air, heavier than before. I thought about his phrasing, the hints, the proximity, the I protect what's mine, the late-night script attempt. Threat doesn't always arrive as a sentence. Yes, I said finally. Her breath caught. Explicitly? Strategically. She closed her eyes. That word carried more weight than any dramatic accusation. Strategically. It meant intent. It meant calculation. It meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a design. The next stage was panic. Daniel began texting more frequently, not just to me, but to Amelia, to extended family members, to mutual friends. Casual check-ins, overcompensation, attempts to stabilize perception. He invited my parents to dinner unexpectedly, spoke about growth, about learning from mistakes. The charm returned, but thinner now, strained at the edges. He texted me once more late at night. Daniel, you could still clarify that I never accessed the actual file. I stared at the message. He was right, technically. He never succeeded. The system blocked him. But intent is recorded even when execution fails. Me. Attempting matters. No anger, no elaboration. He didn't reply. A week later, Amelia called me from her car. They're recommending termination, she said quietly. The words didn't carry shock anymore. Just inevitability. I'm sorry, I said again. And I was. Not for him, for her. Because too late to fix it doesn't only apply to careers. It applies to trust. She exhaled shakily. He says you set him up. I let that settle. I didn't create login attempts at 2:14 a.m., I said calmly. Silence. You're so calm, she whispered. I've had practice. That night I thought about the girl I was at 18, frightened of documentation, ashamed of clinical language describing her vulnerability. If someone had told her that one day records would protect her instead of threaten her, she wouldn't have believed it. Daniel believed he could control the narrative by holding a file over my head. What he didn't understand was this. Records don't belong to the person who fears them. They belong to the person who understands them. By the time he realized that, the system was already in motion. Termination letters aren't dramatic. They're formal, structured, carefully worded, and once issued, they don't invite emotional appeals. Too late to fix it rarely feels explosive. It feels administrative, quiet, final. And the most unsettling part for him? I never raised my voice. I never publicly accused. I was never humiliated. I simply refused to interfere with the consequences he initiated himself. And there's nothing more destabilizing than facing fallout without a villain to blame. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in my sister's living room on a gray Sunday afternoon. Amelia had asked me to come over. Her voice on the phone was steady, not fragile, not furious, just resolved. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, not suspended anymore. Terminated. His firm had issued a formal dismissal citing violations of data access protocol and attempted unauthorized extraction of restricted archives. Clean language. Permanent implications. He stood when I walked in. Not out of respect, out of tension. Amelia remained seated between us on the couch, hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, but clearer. I need to hear this directly, she said softly. No interpretation, no summaries. She looked at Daniel first. Did you attempt to access Kira's medical records? He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Yes. No embellishment, no denial. She turned to me. Did you report him? No, I said calmly. The system flagged repeated attempts automatically. Daniel exhaled sharply. You knew it would escalate. I knew systems function as design, I replied. Amelia's eyes moved between us. Why? She asked him. He rubbed his jaw, avoiding her gaze. I was concerned, he said, about her stability, about potential risk. It was almost convincing. I watched him carefully. You tried to run a data extraction script, I said evenly. Amelia's head snapped toward him. He didn't deny it this time. It was precautionary, he muttered. Precautionary. Against what? Against me speaking? Against losing leverage? Amelia's voice remained quiet. Did you ever threaten her? Silence. He glanced at me, perhaps expecting outrage, emotion, accusation. He found none. Yes, he said finally. Indirectly. That word mattered. Indirectly meant intentionally, ambiguous, deniable, strategic. Amelia closed her eyes briefly. When? She asked. During your trips, I answered before he could shape the narrative. He implied disclosure of out-of-context medical documentation. The room didn't explode. No shouting. No accusations flung across furniture. Just air shifting. Amelia looked at him, not with fury but with comprehension. You used her past to corner her, she said. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to maneuver. I thought she wouldn't push back, he said quietly. She never does. There it was. Not malice. Assumption. He had built his strategy on a version of me that no longer existed. I didn't push back, I said softly. I stepped aside. He looked confused. I let the system handle what you initiated, I continued. That's not revenge. It was the closest I came to defining the entire ordeal aloud. Amelia stood slowly. I need space, she said, not to me, but to him. There were no dramatic ultimatums, no declarations of divorce at that moment, just consequence settling in layers. As I moved toward the door, Daniel spoke one last time. You could have warned me. I paused. I did, I said calmly. When I told you I understand documentation. He said nothing after that. Outside, the air felt cool, neutral. The confrontation hadn't felt triumphant. It hadn't needed to. Heat is loud. Clarity is quiet. And clarity leaves no room to renegotiate reality. It's been 11 months. Amelia filed for separation 4 weeks after that Sunday conversation. Not impulsively, not angrily, methodically. She said trust, once reframed, doesn't return to its original shape. Daniel moved out quietly. There were no public explanations beyond professional misconduct and personal differences. Polite language, contained. People speculate less when you don't feed them drama. As for me, something subtle but irreversible changed. For most of my life, I defined myself by damage control. I believed my role was to soften impact, to absorb tension, to prevent escalation, even if that meant shrinking myself. I thought strength meant endurance. Now I understand something different. Strength is discernment. It's knowing when silence protects and when it enables. It's recognizing that neutrality is not passivity, it's precision. I still work in medical records. I still move carefully. I still prefer calm rooms to loud ones. But I no longer carry shame about being 18 and vulnerable. I requested my full medical file again last month, this time not out of strategy, but closure. I read it the way I would read any patient history, compassionately. A young woman is reacting poorly to medication. A temporary crisis, stabilization, recovery. That's all it was. Not a scandal, not a character flaw. Human. Daniel believed that documentation made me fragile. He didn't realize documentation also proves survival. Amelia and I speak more honestly now, not constantly about what happened, but more directly about discomfort, about boundaries, about intuition. She once told me, I used to think you were the quiet one because you were unsure. Now I realize you were watching. She was right. I was watching, but I'm no longer just observing. I'm choosing when to speak, when to withhold, when to let systems work, when to intervene. The most profound shift isn't external, it's internal. When I walk into rooms now, I don't scan for leverage being used against me. I don't brace for subtle comments. I don't shrink to maintain equilibrium. I take up the exact amount of space I need, no more, no less. And here's the part that surprises people. I don't hate him. Hate is loud, consuming, heavy. What I feel instead is distance. Clear, unemotional distance. He underestimated me because I allowed him to believe a version of me that no longer served me. That's on him. But the transformation, that's on me. I'm still calm, still composed, still deliberating. The difference is this. My silence is no longer protective camouflage. It's chosen power. And that changes everything. If you've listened this far, you might be waiting for a moment of triumph. A declaration. A dramatic line where I say I won. But this was never about winning. It was about alignment. For a long time, I believed keeping the peace was the highest form of love. That absorbing discomfort quietly was maturity. That if I endured enough without reacting, stability would reward me. But stability built on silence isn't stability. It's a postponement. What I learned is simple and not glamorous. Leverage only works when you're ashamed of what someone is holding. The moment you look at your own history without flinching, it loses its edge. My past wasn't dangerous. My fear of it was. And once I removed that fear, the rest became procedural. I didn't expose him. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't retaliate. I let documentation do what documentation does. There's a quiet kind of dominance that doesn't need raised voices or public vindication. It's the ability to remain steady while systems unfold. To refuse participation in your own coercion. To step aside and let consequences meet intent. If you're in a situation where someone is hinting, implying, leveraging something against you, ask yourself, are you protecting peace or are you protecting their comfort? There's a difference, and sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation. It's clarity. So I'll leave you with this. If someone believed your silence meant weakness, what would change if you chose it deliberately instead? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.